All right, so we've covered natural selection. We covered basically in evolution, allelic frequencies will change. And that is the definition of evolution. Allelic frequencies changing one generation to the next. In order to help us measure this, we're going to do some more math. And I know you guys are like, no more math. We're done with math. This is way easier than Hardy-Weinberg. These are fitness problems. Fitness is a measure of reproductive success. It can be measured in lots of different ways that you as the scientist choose. It could be in how many eggs are laid. Look at that frog. He's all like, or she, I got these eggs. I'm protecting them. Life's good. It could be how many offspring survive. Of those eggs, not many are going to live for frogs. I'm not sure if you've seen birds feasting on them. So you could count the number of eggs, but might be a better indicator of how many children are born. Feed the kid worms. Another indication might be how many total offspring survive to reproduction. How many offspring survive long enough to reach sexual maturity? This is that family from like 21 and counting or 22 and counting. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's a family on like TLC. Yeah, the Duggars or something. They 19. Yeah, well, it was 19 at one point, but they just kept going. By any measure of fitness, of biological fitness, they are like the most successful people in the world because they've had the most offspring. Those offspring are all going forward to have more offspring. Can you imagine? The alleles on these parents are spreading much wider than my alleles would spread. Does that make sense? I got 2 kids. And I was like, cool, I have produced just as many alleles as I brought in. Like, my alleles are going out, literally, because my daughter's allele. But my alleles are spreading a bit. Here, they're spreading all over the place. And if each of these kids had 20 kids, and each of those kids had 20 more, it's that same situation we're getting into with cats where you need to spay them. I'm not saying spay humans, but what I'm saying is you're expanding out in the population all of these alleles. By any measure of biological fitness and reproductive success, they are winning this game, and I am dramatically losing. And I'm not trying to catch up. So we can measure it in lots of ways. Number of eggs, number of offspring, number of successful mating attempts. My graduate work for one of my, come on in. Oh, that's an issue. My graduate work for one of my master's degrees was in speciation among fruit flies. And literally, let me tell you the project I did. There I am with a bunch of fruit flies, teeny tiny fruit flies, and a large container, a large plastic, think of it an upside down fish tank. Into this fish tank, I got little sleeves I could put my hands into, and a pipette. You guys know what a pipette is? It's the thing that's at your table right there. I attached that pipette to a tube, and I sat there after I put 2 populations of fruit flies in who had eaten different colored food so I could see their colors. And I would, when I saw them mate, I would sit there for hours to watch for a mating event. I got a lot of watching flies just mate. And as soon as they started mating, I would take this tube and this pipette and suck out the fly. And then put it into another tube where they could just be together and lay eggs. Right? That is a measure of fitness. They were able to have reproductive success. They were able to reproduce. They could mate. So it's going to be up to you as the scientist to define what is success. Once you've defined it, you can do some math with it. We're going to calculate the W value, or the fitness value. Basically, you're going to compare genotypes. You give the value of 1 to the most reproductively successful, and compare everything else to that. Just explaining it that way doesn't really do it much good, so I want to show you an example. I think it'll make a lot more sense after I show you the example. So here we have chickens. I'm going to say, for the sake of this problem, that reproductive success is laying an egg. That makes sense? I mean, the chickens, eggs, they eventually hatch and become offspring. So genotype, we got genotype big A, genotype big A, and genotype little a. Big A produces how many eggs? 12. Big A, little a produces how many? 5. And then little a produces 1. Which of these is the most reproductively successful? Yeah, big A. It makes the most eggs. So we're going to set that value equal to 1, or 12 divided by 12. So far, so good? Any questions on how we got that? All right, now we compare the rest to that. So this guy here, big A, little a, was 5. So he's going to be, his W value is 5 over 12. What's the W value of little a? 1 over 12. Questions? Now from these values, we can make comparisons. We say that's the most, that's the second most, that's the third most. You give them an actual value. Try one on your own. This one about lizards. We got lizards genotype big A, little a produce 2 offspring each. Big A, and little a produce an average of 1 offspring each. What are the relative fitness values? All right, so to determine these fitness values, you're going to say we got big A, little a, little a. We know that there is 1 egg produced by big A, 2 by big A, 1 produced by little a. Our most fit one here is what? Right, the heterozygote, big A, little a. So for that, we're going to say 2 over 2. We know that we're comparing all the rest of that, so it's 1 over 2 and 1 over 2. So we end up with fitness values of 0.5, 1, and 0.5. That's way easier than Hardy-Weinberg, I think. Any issues, questions, concerns on it? Now, natural selection can move in different directions, and usually we think of it in one way. We think of directional selection. One phenotype is selected for above the others. Height. I'm short. You guys see that. I was also short when I was younger, and there is in humans, the height has been steadily increasing since the 1500s that we know of. During the 1500s, a lot of people were about my size. But height has been selected for. People tend to prefer, females tend to prefer to mate with somebody who's taller than they are. As such, over time, the mean, that is the average height of humans, has increased. That is moving in a direction. Now, what would happen if suddenly there was societal change and people decided, we're going to mate with short people? That's the way to go. That's preferential. What would happen? Right, the average size would move in the other direction. So when you have a selective, a directional selection event happening, you're moving in a single direction. You're moving either bigger or smaller. Let's say bird beaks, right? If a bird is on an island and their beak is, the bigger beaks can get into the nuts on the island, smaller beaks can't. You're going to see beaks get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's directional selection. You're moving in a direction. Another type of selection would be stabilizing selection, where you're selecting for an intermediate phenotype, a middle. So let's say you've got, we'll do short on this end, tall on this end. Originally, a fairly standard bell curve. There are a few very, very short people and very few very tall people, and several in the middle. But you have a selection event happening. Women are saying, you know what, I don't want to mate with anybody who's short. So that's out. What's going to happen is directional selection, right? But on the other side, you may have another bit of selection happening. You're choosing for a slightly smaller size. If you get too tall, you slam your head into the door, you die. So you're selecting against that size at the same time. Thus, you stabilize somewhere in the middle. Does that make sense? So we're selecting against the extremes and for an intermediate form, in the middle form. All right, so we've had one direction. Now we've got two directions squeezing in. Now we're going to have a third type called diversifying selection. For diversifying selection, you're selecting against the intermediate phenotype, against the middle. Either super short people mate or tall people mate, but that middle size, nobody's interested. In this case, you're going to get a directional movement away from the center in both directions. Diversifying selection is how we get speciation. You form new species off a single by having, well, one way. You get lots of different ways of getting speciation, but one way is to select for two extremes of the same phenotype. Eventually, they stop mating together entirely. An example of this might be there's some butterflies that are literally right now eating my dill. Like, I went outside, I had dill on my, dill is an herb, I had it on my deck, protecting it from deer, and the caterpillars got it. I have at least two kinds of caterpillars. One is a bright orange that mimics a poisonous butterfly. Another is a bright yellow that mimics a poisonous butterfly. The intermediate phenotype, a sort of a light burnt orange, looks delicious to birds. So I either have this bright yellow kind or this bright orange kind, but not that burnt orange in the middle. Here we go. So here we've got one form, here we've got another form, and here we have an intermediate form. This looks poisonous, that looks poisonous, this looks delicious. So that one's eaten a whole bunch in the middle. The two ends survive just fine. So far, so good. So we have directional selection, where you are getting bigger or smaller. You're choosing a phenotype in one direction. You've got stabilizing selection, where you're choosing for an intermediate phenotype. And you've got diversing selection, where you're choosing for extreme phenotypes. Sometimes you can get what's called balancing selection. In this case, it's not just the form, it's the heterozygote. So it's not the phenotype, it's the genotype that leads to an advantage. Turns out, in humans, we actually do choose people based on their genotype sometimes. There was an experiment that was done, a fairly famous experiment, about the major histocompatibility complex, the MHC. The MHC, the major histocompatibility complex, is basically what helps you build antibodies. So if you have a varied MHC, that is you've got a lot of variation in your histocompatibility complex. No problem. In your histocompatibility complex, then you are more likely to be able to fight off disease. So the more variation, the more chances you have to fight disease. In this experiment, and this is a crazy sounding experiment, what scientists did was they handed people the same t-shirts, the same type of t-shirt, and asked them to work out in them without deodorant. Right, okay, hear me out. It gets gross. So these people work out for an hour, they work out hard, they take off their shirts, and they hang the shirts up on a line. And then they ask the same participants to go and sniff the shirts. And it turned out that especially the women the ones that they found to be the best smells were the ones that had the opposite alleles at their MHC. They could actually smell the allelic change. And that's crazy to me. You chose a mate based on the smell after they were working out. Now, obviously, they didn't go and then force them to mate or anything like that. But you ended up having this experiment that showed in a natural setting, there may be selection for a genotype, a heterozygous genotype. So it balances the alleles. It keeps them present. Now, that was a fairly obscure example. The most common example of heterozygote advantage is this balancing selection is in sickle cell anemia. And this is an extreme example. We've talked about sickle cell anemia being a single nucleotide polymorphism change. If you have sickle cell anemia, your lifespan is shorter. Does that make sense? Like your blood cells clot, you don't survive as well. You may die before reproductive age. So that's bad. You would think then directional selection would push in the other direction, that all of those alleles would just disappear. Why hasn't sickle cell anemia gone away? Turns out that if you live in sub-Saharan Africa and you have sickle cell anemia, you are immune to malaria. The malaria parasite cannot infect the red blood cell, the sickle cell shaped blood cells. Okay, so there's an advantage. But the biggest advantage, obviously, if you have malaria, you don't survive long either. So if you are homozygous dominant, don't have sickle cell anemia at all, you die of malaria. If you have sickle cell anemia, you die, you got sickle cell anemia. But the heterozygotes, the ones that have a big A and a little a, they are both immune to malaria and they don't display symptoms of sickle cell anemia. So those heterozygotes survive just fine. Like, reproductively better than others. You are selecting for the heterozygote. That's balancing selection. It keeps even what would appear to be deleterious alleles in the population. Okay, so far so good. Different type. Those are different types of natural selection. Sexual selection is when one or the other gender chooses their mate based upon very specific sexual characteristics. General rule of thumb, people. In the animal kingdom, if you see something weird, it's because of sex. It is straight up the males are trying to display for females, or females are trying to display for males. Usually it's males trying to display for females. The peacock's tail, for instance, is textbook example of this. How would this help in the in real life for this bird? How would a peacock tail give it any advantage at all? Does it help flight? No. Would it help them evade a predator? Nope. It's pretty easy to grab onto. Basically, there's no advantage aside from females like it. We have two broad types of sexual selection. Intra-sexual selection. Intra means within a gender, within a sex. This is where you see usually males, sometimes females, fighting for territory. Especially female fish. Female fish are mean. They will take each other down. Deer fighting, pushing against each other. Elephant seals slamming into each other. Kangaroos fighting. Kangaroos fighting, they're nasty. Have you ever seen a kangaroo fight? Kangaroo they're going to punch, they're going to kick, they're going to gouge. The toenails on these kangaroos are like razors. Basically, think velociraptor with fur. They will mess you up, but more than that, they'll mess each other up. They're jumping at each other, kicking with their very powerful legs, and gouging. They will disembowel you, and they sometimes disembowel each other. Yeah, no, seriously, kangaroo are mean. There's a story, and I'm pretty sure it's true. So, a kangaroo was being chased by a group of dingoes. Dingoes are wild dogs in Australia. To escape the dingoes, the kangaroo waded out into the middle of a pond. And the group of dingoes, chased the kangaroo into the pond. Now, you'd think it's the end of the kangaroo because it's a single kangaroo, can't take out a whole group of dingoes. But the thing is, the kangaroo standing up, The dingoes were swimming. Literally, the kangaroo held the dogs underwater until they drowned. I mean, they're messed up creatures. They drown puppies. If it's in Australia, it will kill you. If you've ever seen giraffes, male giraffes will beat each other with their necks. Everyone's like, "Oh, look, they're cute and they're cuddling." That's not cuddling. They're trying to establish territory. They're competing for the opportunity to mate. You guys went to high school, yeah? Do you guys remember high school? High school may not be a fun memory for you guys, but you probably observed things. High school is a great place to see people who don't think that they're being influenced by biology, but they are. If you've ever did you ever see a fight? Yeah? Okay. Fights are straight up intrasexual selection. Usually what happens, actually there's two things that go on. But usually you see two guys stand up, or it could be two women. They stand up first. Look at me, look at me, look at me. I'm getting attention. And then there's like bouncing. Like they butt up against each other, just like freaking these guys do. It's hilarious. You also get intersexual selection, where you're displaying, and you see this a lot in high school too. Heck, let me explain some of these. You got an old lizard saying, "Check out my frill. Yes, I have this frill, and you would like to mate with me." Red-breasted robin. It's a red-breasted robin. The females don't look anything like this. They're drab. They look dark because, if you're darker colored, you don't get attacked by predators. Males, bright colors. Peacocks, big and bright. Yes? Inter and intra? That's basically it. Yeah. Fighting is where you're fighting among your, in the cafeteria, two guys get up and they fight each other. They're pushing each other trying to attract a mate. With intersexual, think more, they're competing with each other. Oh, okay. You have been at a red light and the car next to you is playing bass at this insane level, right? That is, look at me. Behold, it's the same thing a bullfrog does. Look at my bass, come mate with me. Now you guys, hopefully you guys can have your own things. I don't know, maybe you choose that. But that would be intersexual. I'm competing by showing off. I came from a small town. I don't know if it happens here. People would drive around parking lots, in their cars, just to show off. It was the weirdest thing ever. But that was straight up, I'm just showing off. Check it out. Come mate with me. Those guys in high school, heck, or go to a gym. Half the time in gym, people are there. You look at them and you're like, you're not here because you're working out. You're here because you're showing off that you're working out. When you guys transfer, and most of you are going to transfer because you're in 102. Most 4-year schools do in fact have gyms that you can go to, and it was the funniest thing in the world to me when I went to college because I'd never set foot in a gym. Most of the people in my dorm never went to a gym, but by God, they all started going, and they didn't go to work out. They went so other people could see them working out, and thus attract a mate. That would be intersexual. Look at me, look at me, look at me. I'm awesome. Now keep looking at me. So we got intrasexual, where two of the same gender are fighting it out. Intersexual, where you're just showing off. It's a fashion show. So have you guys ever heard of the narwhal? Yeah, narwhal's pretty cool. What's the defining feature of a narwhal? It's big, long horn. Males have this super big long horn. Why do they have that big long horn? I've asked other classes this before. I want to see what you guys think. It's a tooth. It's a big snaggle tooth coming out of their mouth. But why do they have it? Yeah, they gore other animals. Yeah, totally, right? People are like, they use it for hunting, for goring other things. They go and stab it. Think about this. If you're trying to stab a fish to eat, and you stick it on this big long horn, how do you get it in your mouth? My students came up with the idea, so they go up to an ice floe, and they start wiping it off. No, it's absolutely not for protection. It's too weak for protection. You know what they use it for? I kid you not. Scratching the belly of the female narwhal. Right? If you guys if you're ever in a relationship ever in your life, there will be a point where you're like, I have this itch on my back that I cannot reach. And then that person is the savior. That's literally what the narwhal does with its horns, with its tusk. Scratch, 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 scratch. And it got that long because females were selecting for the males that had the longest tooth, the longest weird snaggle tooth. Now, this sexual selection is going to be compensated for by reactions to predators. Because remember, these aren't happening just all by themselves. These things are happening in context, for lack of a better word. Obviously, if the peacock's tail kept getting longer and longer and longer, eventually it couldn't move. Now, if there were no predators around, that might be the case. That might be where it gets to. But predators act as a balance to this sexual selection. Guppies. You go to what are those? Pet store, and you're going to see guppies of all these bright colors. And all of those alleles do exist in nature, but you don't see guppies that look like this in nature. Why not? Why don't you see guppies with stupidly long fan-shaped tails and bright colors? They get eaten. They're bright, so they're easily seen, and they have long tails, so they don't swim as well. Predators can keep the impact of sexual selection down. Remember that selection is acting not just on one trait, but on all traits simultaneously.